Welcome to part 3 of Unit 3. If anybody is wondering what TRI stands for, Temporary Remote Instruction, and we sure do hope it's temporary, folks. Along the lines of our multicultural Santana song we finished part 2 with, we're going to continue into the islands of Jamaica today. So ska, dub, and reggae are the three dominant styles of music from Jamaica. Couple things to consider: that Jamaica was a colony of Great Britain until 1963. So there's a lot of influence coming from the continental European areas to the island of Jamaica and back and forth. A lot of Jamaicans lived in Great Britain, still do, and their music and culture traveled back and forth quite a bit. Ska is generally the popular music, sometimes more danceable, but sometimes as we evolve through the time frame of Jamaican music evolution, it's harder to determine the difference between a ska song and a reggae song depending on the song. Dub is the direct predecessor to some of our hip-hop DJs and even disco DJs later on in the 70s. Disc jockeys in Jamaica would take out the vocals, strip away any extraneous sounds, and add tons of reverb and echo and create these sort of instrumental dance mixes. And occasionally would call out and add their own vocal tracks, but a lot of them didn't have as much in the vocal area. We're not going to be studying a specific example of dub, but it was a huge influencer for future styles we will study. And of course, it's connected to a style of the early O's called dubstep. But early ska is what we're going to listen to when we listen to Desmond Dekker. He was the king of the blue beat. That is an English term. Remember, the connection between Great Britain and Jamaica is very strong. Even though by 67 they were a fledgling country on their own, they still carried a lot of the traditions and the influences from England. 007 being James Bond. He's very English. So there's this play on what they call signifying, which we had from the blues, not completely telling the story out overtly. They had just recently been under, English rule, but there's a play on the poverty of the shanty towns, which are kind of like the projects, and this idea of this hero, this 007 figure that was supposed to come save them. Not all the lyrics are translatable directly to the global community in that way. It's sometimes more of an inside message. Some of the distinctions here musically: the hesitation beat is a big one. Let's see if I can get It is very self-explanatory to a certain extent. There's many ways to play a beat. You can play ahead of the beat a little. You can be right square in the middle of it, and that tends to become a little bit more robotic in its feel. Or you can hesitate until almost the last minute, and that's what's happening with the hesitation beat. It tends to give the Jamaican sound that laid-back, kind of chill quality that we all kind of associate. This was also a song featured in a very important movie about Jamaica called The Harder They Come, and it's titled down here. Our next song will be the title track from that. And it was really unusual to see this kind of a film. It's a story of a up-and-coming musician trying to make it in his own way through the difficult times of the mean streets of Kingston, Jamaica, which can be very rough at the time, being torn between his desire for music and the drug world and gangs and a lot of that. It's a gritty film. Its production quality is a little bit low, but it's historically important. So go ahead and pause, load up 007 Shantytown by Desmond Dekker, and come on back when you are done. Okay. So reggae is defined in a lot of different ways. It's the third in the age chronology that I told you, ska. Dub really takes both styles and starts to mess with it. And then reggae is overlapping. These are not, chiseled in stone time frames. There's a lot of overlap in this kind of evolution. But reggae is often connected to the Rastafarian religion. It has sometimes a little higher production quality than early ska might have, because it becomes the dominant style that really does become a little more global. And this is Jimmy Cliff. He is singing the title song from the film I just mentioned a moment ago, The Harder They Come. It has a little more vocal finesse. I think it'd be a good adjective for his treatment of this. The R&B vocal styles are a little more prevalent. It's not quite so pop as the Desmond Dekker seems to be. And the whole main theme here is the theme of oppression, working against the oppressors, which connects to the Rastafarian religion as well. They have a lot of connection to Haile Selassie, which is their Messiah, who is what the word Rastafari really means. It is his name. And there's a lot of connections to Judeo-Christian teachings as well. So a lot of the songs will be dealing with that. Some of them are dealing with those that aren't being treated fairly. So the downtrodden, you could sort of qualify them in that manner. People who were treated poorly by the justice system, whether they are from Jamaica or from another part of the globe. So, and then love, of course, is never out of style. That's always a great theme for the music. So please note the difference. The previous song, let me go back. Maybe not. Apparently not. The previous song is listed as ska, and ska has many waves, but we're only going to deal with one or two of them at the most. And then this one is listed as reggae. So pause, take a listen to The Harder They Come by Jimmy Cliff from 1972, and come on back. Okay. Most people do not argue the point that the poster person and band for reggae was Bob Marley. Bob Marley and the Wailers was the name of his band. There are many really excellent documentaries about his life, his struggles, his assassination attempt, his determined way of not taking a political side when his government wanted him to take a side. And then ultimately the tragedy of his death from cancer, from skin cancer, melanoma, ultimately is what he died from. But his message is really what took reggae global. There's probably very few places on the planet that you can go that have not heard of some of the music of Bob Marley and the Wailers, or just Bob Marley. We have I Shot the Sheriff, which is his song, but was covered by an English performer named Eric Clapton, very famously. And for many white listeners initially who weren't initiated into reggae yet, they may have discovered it through Eric Clapton's cover version of it. It does tell a story of a bit of an anti-hero, and I even hesitate to call it an anti-hero because the heroes in African culture can be quite complex. But this is a gentleman who has not shot the sheriff, but he did shoot the deputy. And so he has a complex approach to it, and it's that long-running history of African culture of the hero having also stepped over the bounds maybe of the legal system or of the justice system or whatever oppressor that they may be fighting against. So again, pause your video, come back, and we will continue on with some more great music. Okay, welcome back. So ska, as I mentioned a couple of moments ago, is analyzed in multiple what they call waves. And I'm not even sure what wave we are on now. There's been so many reiterations of it. But one really prominent one was second wave ska from the 70s. Connected very much to British punk to a certain extent, connected very much to a rise of racial tension in the UK. There was some pretty ugly racism happening in certain areas of the UK. And some of our established bands, like the Police, like the Clash, not only did they like the sounds of this music and went in a sometimes more dancey direction, particularly with the Clash, they wanted to show unity in a rise against this racism that was happening rampantly in the UK. So these are two short examples. When you pause your video, see if you can hear the different reggae influences. I personally think that the Police example is a little more hesitation beat, a little easier to, I think, to hear that reggae influence than the Clash. The Clash's song, This Is Radio Clash, really takes on some of that clubhouse Jamaican dance hall feel, less so than the hesitation beat so much of the Walking on the Moon song. So pause, take a listen as you're staring at the slide, and come on back. All right, onward we march. What are these guys doing in the middle of a thing about reggae? What? And ska? Well, we're headed toward a very important art movement for music in New York. And this band, although very, very important in the late 60s, didn't fit a particular category at that time. They weren't specifically acid rock or psychedelic rock or country rock or any of those. They really forged paths of their own. And this is the Velvet Underground with Nico. Nico is the name of the blonde lady in the middle there. They were very inspirational to a side of New York musical creator that didn't want to go mainstream. They didn't want the top 40. They didn't want to be part of disco. They wanted to reclaim something they felt was lost in rock and roll. Some of them were literary people who wanted to set their poetry and their reinterpretation of old rock lyrics to a new audience. The Velvet Underground was very inspirational because they did work outside the box and they pushed the envelope. They were part of the scene at a place called The Factory, which was Andy Warhol's hangout. Andy Warhol's name is right there. He was briefly their manager, but they really didn't need managing per se, but he's very much connected with the Velvet Underground. They were the house band at The Factory, his hangout. They did a lot of unusual things musically. They were inspired by classical music. John Cale, this gentleman here, plays a viola, which is that instrument right there. It's a string instrument that's held a lot like a violin, but it's larger and lower in sound. I call it like a violin on steroids. Minimalism is a style of 20th century classical music that's highly repetitive and stripped down to fairly minimal elements, and that was very much interesting to them. And they allowed themselves to have a freedom to create kind of noisy, unusual sounds. And so they really are kind of the godfathers and godmothers of what's called noise rock, way before that really even becomes a genre into its own. One of the examples of the interesting sounds they would make is their drummer, Mo Tucker. She is pictured back there with the little red pixie haircut. She's a tiny woman and stand on the edges of the bass drum as it was flipped on its side and pound on it with soft mallets like you might see in a marching band or something, like a monkey pounding on a kitchen pot or something, and it creates a very interesting timbre. Heroin is exactly about what you think it is. It's about the drug heroin. I want to caution that it is not a promotion of heroin use. We have a rampant problem with heroin use. So this last bullet point, not a glorification of heroin use, is very important. Although the lead singer Lou Reed really did struggle at different times in his life with addiction, and particularly heroin addiction. But it's creating an atmosphere of somewhat frightening perspective. The tempo increases very much like the blood pressure and the heart rate would increase when one was getting a fix of a heroin injection or even smoking it. It has a very kind of haunting quality to it. So keep that in mind when you listen to it. The term avant-garde is defined in a number of ways, but you can kind of loosely define it as on the cutting edge, and they definitely were. They were very ahead of their time. And again, they are going to be an influence for this next category that we're getting to. So pause, listen, come on back. I'll be here. So if you guessed or not, we are getting to punk rock. And contrary to some others' thoughts or assumptions, punk rock does not begin in England. It becomes global by the English bands. They really make a loud noise and they really define some of the fashion as well. But it really starts in the funky little clubs in New York City with, as what I mentioned before, those subcultures of music that weren't happy with the status quo or the mainstream. They didn't always look like they had the mohawks and the piercings and the torn clothing quite yet. And this band is a good example of that. Kind of bridge a weird, bizarre glam look while having an intensity that would be defined as punk. So we have them in a category we're calling New York punk. For this section of your study, it's going to be important for you to distinguish where our artists are from. Are they English or are they American? And even in the United States, we're going to want to distinguish between New York and West Coast when the time comes. Some of the things punk rockers were missing was the simple structures that were present in, say, really pioneering 50s, simple songs, chord changes that were predictable, and yet they wanted to intensify it. They were tired in some cases of long instrumental jams, heavily overly produced music. Some of them didn't care for the progressive rock. A lot of them did not like the corporate rock that was going on, big bloated sort of, again, overly produced stuff. And they wanted to make a statement for their generation in particular. So listen to Personality Crisis to get an early dose of New York punk from the New York Dolls. They were one of the first to be on TV in England, so they did have a huge influence on young kids who were thinking some of the same stuff. So pause, listen, come on back. All right. Probably the most famous punk rock band from New York are the Ramones. There is not a Ramone among them. It is a stage name. And they got the name from the old Beatle, Paul McCartney, who on some side projects, and more so when he would sometimes you had to sign in for hotels where you were registering and things, he used a fake name, Paul Ramone. And so we have a connection to some of the royalty of rock and roll through the Ramones and through the name. They stripped it way down. The faster the better, the more aggressive the better. Some of their songs are like only a minute and a half or barely 2 minutes long. They love to pull from old influences. In this case, Sheena, as a punk rocker, has a very assertive surf rock feel to it. Lots of the twangy kind of bass stuff that we would hear in some of our surf rock as well. They were enormously influential to the UK punk scene. They physically didn't get there like the New York Dolls did until a little bit later, but the music, the records, the 45s and the albums got over to England really quickly. Many UK musicians who would later form punk bands learned to play their instruments by following along to the Ramones records. So pause, take a listen, come on back. All right, some good Ramones. So we get to England. And probably the most successful, most prominent, successful might be a bad choice of words. The most prominent English punk band is the Sex Pistols. Their manager, Malcolm McLaren, is a gentleman who was over in the New York scene at clubs like CBGB, at Max's Kansas City, which is another club that some of them would frequent, and seeing this stuff sort of evolve through all kinds of interesting bands. And he had a clothing store in England with his wife, Vivienne Westwood, who is still a fashion designer last time I checked. And they were really interested in some of the fashion they were starting to see. And of course, the music was really key to that because it's all tied in. They had some kids in their store. Their store sold fetish clothing, lots of leather and latex and interesting looking stuff. And they had these kids, Paul Cook over here, and Steve Jones, who's kind of hidden behind the words over here. Sid Vicious is over here. He did not join until later. But these two juvenile delinquents were stealing from Malcolm McLaren's store. Then they started begging him they knew that he had been in New York City. They kept begging him to help them form a band. And they put a flyer on some of the local telephone poles and walls looking for a lead singer. And they happened upon this guy right here, John Lydon, but he went by the stage name of Johnny Rotten. One of the legends says he got the name because his teeth were so bad they looked like they were rotting out of his face. Pretty icky. He has obviously since, if you've seen any pictures of him after this, had some teeth work done, but he did not like the status quo. He came into the audition wearing a t-shirt he had customized himself that he wrote "I Hate" on it, and it was a Pink Floyd t-shirt. Well, if you were an English teenager at the time in the 70s, Pink Floyd was royalty, huge. And to deface a t-shirt like that was very punk rock, to say the least. They got in a lot of trouble. They were always getting people annoyed at them. They were always insulting people in their music, and they had a potty mouths and a bad attitude, and everybody who was under the age of 20 loved it. They decided they were going to premiere the song "God Save the Queen" on a boat in the River Thames in the middle of London, not too far behind the Queen's actual boat during her Jubilee. And they got in again, more trouble. A number of them were arrested, and it's a famous scene. You can find, sometimes you can find clips of it on YouTube. You might want to take a look. So pause your video here, listen to "God Save the Queen" from '77 by the Sex Pistols, and come on back. All right, so we get to the West Coast here, and we have a number of acts that are responding to different things. The English kids have even a worse economic situation than American teenagers did, or young people did. And West Coast versus East Coast had different concerns they wanted to express in their music. The West Coast bands, particularly Los Angeles, really were reacting to some of the Hollywood phony baloney and what we call conspicuous consumption. You know, there's lots of homeless people, but they're sleeping under a billboard for somebody who's making millions of dollars, you know, in the Hollywood industry, very likely. San Francisco had its own set of the similar issues. They're represented by a band called the Dead Kennedys, and they're in a category called hardcore punk. They're one of the beginning groups to really amp up not only the intensity of the music, but also the intensity of their lyric. It's very highly political music. I will back up a tiny bit. Los Angeles is represented by a number of excellent groups, but X, Black Flag, the Germs, there's many, there's a list of them. And then our lovely county of Orange tended to become a lot more aggressive, and in categories which has now been titled suburban punk. A lot of the teens and the youth of the area were tired of living in cul-de-sacs where everybody's house looked the same, and you were trying to keep up with the Joneses, and punk rock offered an opportunity to at least express something different. Sometimes it's called surf punk, which is slightly different, or even beach punk. So those bands listed the Adolescents and Social Distortion, although a little bit later than some of the earlier ones, represented and still do in some cases that kind of punk rock. So take a moment and compare and contrast a few of these different sounds from what you might have heard in the New York scene or in the UK scene. So pause and come on back. So one of the problems with the youth movement is that kids can't drink, and they couldn't get in the clubs because the clubs weren't letting anybody in unless they were over the drinking age, which depended from state to state what it was. So on the East Coast again, a movement was started by Ian MacKaye and a number of other people, but he's one of the leaders, called the Straight Edge Movement. The name of the band is Minor Threat, but he also started a label and another band called Fugazi. This is in the DC area. It's a very high intensity sound. Straight Edge is one of the shortest punk rock songs I've ever found. It's only like 43 seconds in entirety. And it really is a kind of a screaming pronouncement of this new movement that promised abstinence from drugs and in some cases even sex for exchanging for being part of the scene. You know, someone 16 wanted to be part of the scene, and they'd say, hey, put an X on our hand, let us into the club, and if you catch us drinking, you can kick us out. But we want to be part of the music, we want to be part of the scene. The straight edge movement sadly gets a little bit violent when it gets out to the West Coast. It seems like we have a propensity to do that out here, where they would actually beat up kids who were partying. So that seems sort of anti-intuitive to the movement, but the original intent was to be clean and sober and abstinent as part of a commitment to be part of the scene. So after 43 seconds, come on back, go listen to Straight Edge, and we'll continue on. We're almost at the end. All right, welcome back. We have the corporate types who really hated punk when it first came out and were very vocal about hating it, but eventually could see that they could earn a little dough from this scene. There were lots of young people, not too different from how many young people were in the 50s, who had money to spend on music. And they liked these punk bands, and they liked the energy that it had. And it was a do-it-yourself environment where they could buy a cassette tape of some band they like for just a couple bucks and a self-addressed envelope. And, you know, the corporate types didn't like that independent stuff going on behind their backs. So in some cases, they kind of created this title, New Wave. It's a double-edged title. Some found it offensive. I don't think that Elvis Costello cared one way or the other. He's one of ours listed in this slide here. But I'm pretty sure the Talking Heads weren't really enamored with the title New Wave. Pretty sure that David Byrne, the lead singer, would not have cared for that because it really was kind of cleaning up punk to make it more mass appealing, which is not really what the purpose of punk was in its heyday. But needless to say, they are in a category because they have a different kind of sound. Chrissie Hynde and the Pretenders is considered new wave, and she had no problem whatsoever with being put in that category. It's a vast category that doesn't have one particular style of music in it. Some cases, like in the case of Devo, it uses some early electronics, which are really funky and hilarious to listen to. But we have these two examples of Psycho Killer from '77 by the Talking Heads and Radio Radio by Elvis Costello, an English musician. He doesn't like too many labels, so I won't force him into one. That was not supposed to be broadcast on Saturday Night Live. That's what SNL stands for down here, Saturday Night Live. But he rebelled and anyhow stopped midway and told his band to go ahead and perform it. Radio Radio is a criticism of the very industry that television and radio are broadcast on. So the producers of Saturday Night Live didn't want him to do it. Well, if you're going to be punk rock, that's something you're going to do, is you're going to say, screw you, establishment, I'm going to do it my way. And it's a very famous scene. It would be over 20 years before Elvis Costello and any of his bands would be invited back to Saturday Night Live. He eventually would reappear, but that would be it for him for a while. So pause, take a listen. This is the end of part 3 of Unit 3. And I'll see you all in part 4.